can remember the smell of the blood, um, that horror inside. I can relive it totally. I'm tired. Physically, emotionally, I'm tired. I drank a lot of sleeping pills. Nightmares galore. The most beautiful movies you can imagine. In a lot of those nightmares, I actually was dying. I always dreamt I was shot up into pieces, or I was trying to kill somebody and that person didn't want to die. I'm a cowboy. Policeman, we are tough cops. We're not there for pills, taking medication. We're good guys, man. Cowboys don't cry. But today I know cowboys do cry. And one of the guys phoned me from the scene. He told me, listen, you've got one hell of a murder scene here. So I went and I phoned several of my guys. I told him, listen, I need speed. I need dedication. Right, get in your car and move.
And you could realize that there was really a war there. And it was really shocking.
Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel, and thank you very much for joining me here again today. I hope that everyone is doing very well. On this channel we have spoken about familicide before, such as the Henry van Breda case, the Adlington family murders, and the Griquas murders, and so on. So this is not a new category for us, but even though we have spoken about it before, it is still very shocking. And there are many studies where they talk about what drives someone within a family to murder their entire family. And with the Griquas murders that we spoke about months, probably even a year ago, this case was based on a younger member of the family committing these murders. And that is what we are going to focus on today as well. How, if you cannot trust who you're sleeping next to, who you share a bed and a bathroom with, then who can you really trust? But over the holidays, I was lucky enough to read one of my friend's books, and it was called Bad Kids by Chris Carsten. And like I said, my friend lent it to me, and I came across this case. But with too much being said, let's just get into today's case.
Intended for mature audiences only.
For today's case, we are heading back to the early 2000s, where times were somewhat more simple. Social media was in its absolute infancy, and barely even a twinkling in the eye of the masses and what we know today of social media. So to get the latest news or gossip, you would have to look at newspapers, magazines, or even word of mouth. We take for granted how quickly we are able to get hold of someone, tell someone something, or gain access to the latest news. When this case took place, it was not widely known in South Africa at the time because the means of getting the information was limited. But let's pause there and get into the case. Ronald Frederick Hunt, more affectionately known as Ronnie, was born in South Africa in 1953. Elizabeth Katharina was born in 1954, who would later become his wife. Ronald and Elizabeth met in 1975 and were also married in the same year. And in 1976, Elizabeth gave birth to their first child, Ronnie Jr. Then, in 1979, the couple had their second child named Rion. Then, in 1986, their third and last child would be born, and his name was Alro. The Hunt family stayed in a small town called Rates, which is a farming town in the Free State. Now in South Africa, generally, work is very tough to get, but if you live in a small town, it is even harder or even more difficult to get a job, and you are basically at the mercy of any big industries that are within the small town that you live in, because these massive companies would be the biggest employers of the people living in the closest vicinity. Now in Rates, during the early 2000s, the main companies, or the biggest employers rather, in the area was a steel works company and an agricultural company. So both Ronald and Elizabeth worked for the agricultural company, where Ronald mostly focused on selling cars for the company or big farming vehicles, whereas Elizabeth would work more in the administration section. And Ronald Hunt loved golfing. This was his hobby, and this is what he absolutely loved to do on weekends, and he would spend most of his money upgrading his gear or really learning the technique very well. And his three boys would often come along with him, and they would grow up learning to play golf as well. It seems though that in the book, Ronnie Jr., which is Ronald and Elizabeth's oldest son, he seemed to be Ronald's favorite, but a parent would never fully admit that. But he was mostly around with Ronald, and they would often go golfing together, and him and Ronnie Jr. were very close and very good at golfing. According to other people who lived in Rates, the Hunt family was very well liked. They knew a lot about them, they knew a lot of people, and they were known as the Hunt boys or the Hunt family. But as far as I could see, the boys had a very normal childhood. Nothing was really mentioned about the boys' trauma or what they had been through in their childhood, if there was any at all, but it didn't seem to be. It seemed that Elizabeth and Ronald were very close to their children and they really wanted the best for them. But the oldest two boys, Ronnie Jr. and Rion, grew up and moved out to study and live in Pretoria, now known as Tshwane. Now, with other siblings, sometimes you do get compared to your siblings. This sibling is better at this, the other sibling is better than that. What are you good at? And that's kind of how Alro felt as the youngest child. He was constantly being compared to his older brothers in terms of academics and as well as what they accomplished while they were at the same school. And it seems as though Alro felt that he couldn't reach that expectation that was expected of him. But as teenagers do, they rebel. And actually, Alro didn't attend the same high school as his two older brothers because there seemed to be some type of mix-up about his enrollment. So he then went to a boarding school in another province. So Alro was at boarding school and his teachers loved him. Alro was quite a quiet boy. He was not the best academically, but he was by all means a bright child. But as Alro started to grow up, he kind of mixed with the wrong crowds and he started to change a lot. So when the boys from the boarding school would come home to the Rates area specifically, and not only from the boarding school but other schools as well, when school was broken up for school holidays, there were a lot more police calls. And I guess you could say in a small town and in a very small community, what's the saying that idle minds make for a devil's workshop or something like that? But these kids in Rates had nothing to do, so they would find something to do. And there were a lot of police calls, mostly based on satanic rituals or satanic cults apparently at the time, because a lot of church doors were being burned, cemeteries were being graffitied over, and specifically kids or children's tombstones were being picked on specifically. But that is what the townsfolk or the people were calling in to police about, and they thought that it was some type of cult. But it was just naughty kids. But with regards to Alro, he was being naughty. He would come home from boarding school, his parents were waiting at the door, very excited for some attention as they do, but nope, Alro would head straight through the door, straight past his parents, and put his bags down, and then head back out the front door to go drinking and partying with his friends. And just as a side note, we need to remember that Alro is only about 15 or 16 years old at the time. So he's being incredibly rebellious and incredibly rude and naughty to his parents. And also the legal drinking age in South Africa is 18. And I know we can't all say that we haven't had a drink before 18, but it is illegal. But Alro would take it a step further and he would be incredibly rude to his parents. He would often not come home. He would just come home to sleep if he had to. And he would basically be out all day getting drunk, high, and whatever else he could do to avoid going home. When Alro's parents would say no and put their foot down, he would be absolutely pissed. He would shout, scream, throw things about, and just storm out of the house. But then, on Thursday the 12th of September 2002, Ronald called a friend who was actually the family doctor at the time just to talk about the strange behavior of their son Alro. And the doctor said that he would make an appointment to meet the family on Monday, the 16th of September 2002. But sadly, that meeting would never take place. Because it was school holidays times, school has broken up, varsity has also broken up, so the older two Hunt brothers were also due to come back to Rates, and that was Ronnie Jr. and Rion. But unfortunately, Rion was unable to come home because he had work commitments at the time as well, but Ronnie Jr. was on his way back to Rates. And Elizabeth thought that Ronnie Jr. coming home would kind of help Alro a little bit because she thought that maybe Ronnie Jr. could talk to Alro about his behavior and see if things could change. However, in the Rates home over this weekend was Elizabeth, the mom, Ronald, the dad, Alro, the youngest, and the eldest son, Ronnie Jr. But then, once Ronnie Jr. arrived, he settled down, he had something to drink and something to eat, and everyone just chatted. And then he noticed that his brother Alro came home, so he then started talking to his brother, and then he asked him to talk to him outside. The two started chatting, and then it was brought up that Alro's attitude was a bit hectic, and Alro then flipped his lid, and he got really upset with his brother talking to him about his attitude. He thought that he understood what he was going through, but he felt that Ronnie Jr. wasn't, and things just blew up really unexpectedly for for Ronnie Jr. He didn't expect this type of reaction from Alro, and also for it to be so sporadic and so intense. But as Alro is going on and on about how Ronnie Jr. doesn't understand, Ronnie's just trying to say that you need to find a better friend group. These friends aren't helping you. Look how much you've changed. This is not my brother. And things just got really heated then. So Alro then stormed out of the house and he said he was going to go stay with his friends and he just left. He didn't say anything else to his parents. He didn't take anything and he just walked to his friend's house. But on Saturday, the 14th of September, as usual in South Africa, there's usually a rugby game or some type of sport game on the Saturday. And on this weekend specifically, there was a rugby match and the whole of Race was going to watch this rugby match. So Alro then went to his friend's house, like we said, and there they went and watched the rugby for a couple of hours where they drank heavily, they smoked heavily, and they just got really, really intoxicated. It first started with 2 beers between them, and there were only 3 friends, 3 teenage boys, 15 or 16 years old, drinking this. Then they found a full bottle of brandy, which they then finished between the 3 of them. And might I reiterate one more time that they were around 15 to 16 years old. So that's a lot of alcohol for these young boys. And maybe it's just the fact that thinking about drinking a whole bottle of brandy will most likely put me in a hangover for 4 to 5 business days. But for a 16-year-old, that's quite a lot. But anyway, so Alro and his friends, they finished the booze, they finished the rugby, and then Alro decided now that he was going to walk home. And I say walking very lightly because he was almost in a crawl. But when Alro got home, his family, his mom, dad, and older brother were still sitting on the couch and they were like, "Oh, Alro, come sit with us." And then his dad got a waft of the amount of booze that Alro had. And Ronald absolutely flipped his lid as well. He started shouting at Alro, "Where were you? What were you doing? Why do you smell like alcohol?" And Alro also raged and they started fighting and bickering at each other, like right in the face. And then all of a sudden, Ronald just smacks Alro in the face. And Alro just stands there for a second. He stops. He then turns and he walks towards his room. Now we thought that he was walking towards his room, but actually Alro walked past his room into his parents' bedroom. He then knelt down next to his mom's side of the bed. He opened a box, took out his mom's small pistol that she kept there for safety. He sat at the bottom of the bed on the floor, loading each bullet into the gun, and then he calmly got up. He walked towards the lounge, but almost, as we pause there, simultaneously as Alro left the bedroom to go into the lounge through this passageway, his parents, his mom and dad, then decided that, this is a bit hectic. Let me go talk to Alro. Let me try and sort it out. So they're also walking down this passage. Dad in front, mom behind, Alro now coming towards dad. So Alro now sees his dad and he points the gun point blank at his dad, shoots him straight between the eyes, and he then flops to the ground. His mom is completely taken aback. He then points the gun straight at his mom as well, point blank between the eyes. She then falls to the ground. Ronnie Jr. hears the commotion. He jumps over the couch and starts walking towards the passageway. There he sees his mom lying on her back with his dad's head resting on his mom's lap, blood everywhere. And Ronnie Jr. then takes a look up at his brother, who's 16 years old, pointing a gun straight at his face. And just like that, Alro then pulls the trigger to the gun and tries to shoot his brother in the face. But just in that split second, as Alro made eye contact with his older brother, Ronnie Jr. slightly moved to the side, where the gun then slightly grazed his cheek, but the bullets went straight through. Ronnie Jr. then fell to the floor, and Alro then walked up to his brother and shot him point blank in the face. Now, Alro stopped. He had a look around, still absolutely pissed, but sober enough to put bullets in a gun and point them directly and aim perfectly between the eyes each time, but still pissed, and he's kind of swaying around. He then looks around, he sees his brother dead, his parents dead. He then walks over to the counter, grabs his dad's car keys, and then he heads out back to his friend's house. There, he continues to drink with his friends. He continues to act like nothing happened. And his friends in the book said that he looked and sounded absolutely normal. There was nothing different about Alro that night. But a couple hours later, Alro then wants to get back into his dad's bakkie. He then puts the keys in the ignition, turns the ignition, but the petrol light is flashing. So he's like, oh, okay. So he then gets out of the bakkie, walks back to his house, because it's very close. They all live quite close to each other. He then walks back to his parents' house a couple blocks away. He then steals his dad's cell phone, takes it, and anything that he had in his wallet, any kind of rands or anything, he then leaves the house. He leaves his family lying dead and bloody on the floor. He then walks to another area of rates where he then sells his father's cell phone for money, and he then gets a little petrol can. He puts some petrol into the bucky, and then he starts driving around. And he didn't actually go home that night. He went and he drove to the petrol station where he could put in more petrol, and then he slept at the petrol station that night. And it seemed as though Alro would just drive around that Sunday, and eventually he decided that he was now going to drive to Bloemfontein because his aunt lived in Bloem and he thought that maybe he could stay there. So he's now on his way to Bloemfontein, but this is like late Sunday, so it's quite late, and we're now heading into Monday morning. So a few hours go by, and just like in the week, like every week, the Hunt family had a domestic worker or a lady who would come and clean the house most days of the week, and her name was Emily. And Emily got there as usual around 8 o'clock, 8:30 in the morning, and she thought that it was quiet and suspiciously quiet that Monday. She knocks on the door, no answer, and she's very used to Elizabeth coming running at the door, very happy to see her, but Elizabeth wasn't there, so she thought that maybe she just caught the family unaware. So Emily then went around the back to the sliding door, and she notices a very dark stain on the sliding door, but she manages to pull it open, and she then steps into the house where it is very quiet. And then Emily's kind of having a look around, and she sees just over the couch where the sliding door is that there's Ronnie Jr. lying in a pool of blood. She then screams, she steps back, and she's not having it. She calls the police, and now the Hunt family's home is swarming with Rates police officers. But when the police came and the coroners came, they noticed that there were only 3 bodies there. There was Mom, Dad, Elizabeth, and Ronald, and Ronnie Jr., the eldest son. But they knew that Alro was there because he lived there and it was school holidays, so where was he? So the police actually thought that there was something wrong because the bucky had been stolen from the front garden and there was a missing child now, basically. Rion was called while he was still working in Pretoria, and he came screaming down to the Free State because he was absolutely worried about his family, and he really just hoped that everything was okay with his younger brother. Obolo was then set out for the Hunt's bucky, and if you have ever driven on big freeways here in South Africa, you will know that the traffic cops like to hide in the gravel dirt on these big roads, where they will then try and look for any suspicious activity. And that is exactly what happened with Alro. So these traffic cops are now sitting in between the bushes. You know those like side stop roads where there's like this big gravel dirt and there's like some trees and like little bins. So the cops were hanging out there, and they see this bucky come screaming past. So they kind of think it's suspicious. The one then starts tailing this bucky, and they then notice that it's the bolo and the number plate vehicle that they have now been looking for. So these traffic cops then radio this in, and the investigators who are working on the Hunt's family murder now say, please keep on their tail, we need to find out who's in the vehicle. So the traffic cops are kind of driving and they're trying to see who's in this vehicle, and the whole time they're looking, this vehicle's like putting foot now on the petrol, and he's going and he's slowing down, and he's going and he's slowing down, and the traffic cops are like, okay, it's kind of weird, and he's kind of swerving and he's driving incredibly recklessly. And then all of a sudden they can see in the little gap between the little bucky window there that there's a person in the vehicle holding a gun to their head the entire time, and then putting it back and then taking it away, putting it back and taking it away. So the traffic cops knew that there was something hectically wrong, and they thought whoever was in the vehicle is now going to end their own lives, but they were unsure who it was, if it was Alro or if it was a person who murdered the Hunt family with Alro still in the bucky. But eventually the person in the bucky then decided, you know what, I've had enough. So they then completely put foot on brake and they dead stop in the middle of this freeway. The traffic cops then get out, they see who's in the vehicle, and it's young 16-year-old Alro Hunt. With Alro, he was crying and there was snot coming down. He was absolutely belligerent. But the traffic cops then arrested him as best they could, and they then took him back to the Rates police station. So Alro appeared in court the very next day, and when he was in court, he just cried and he sobbed in his arms the entire time. And his principal and friends from his boarding school were there to attend, and his principal felt that he should attend because he said that he was a good kid and that no one was there. He obviously shot his parents, so he had no support. So the principal wanted to be there to support him. But before the proceedings went any further, Alro was sent for psychiatric testing and he spent a month there. But then, in May of 2003, the trial started, and it was very private because Alro was a minor at the time when he murdered his parents. But Alro did turn 17 while in custody. Alro pleaded guilty to murdering his family, and he was charged by the judge with 3 counts of murder and 1 count of illegal possession of a firearm. But the prosecutors in this case had a very strong case, and they believed that Alro wasn't actually crying because he had murdered his parents, but he was crying because the life that he knew and that he was accustomed to now was coming to an end. Because he wasn't crying the next day when he was driving around looking for something to do or finding a place to hide when he had just shot his parents, or the night that he did shoot his parents and went drinking, or the Monday when he was running from police. So the prosecution really thought that this guy was just crying because he got caught. But on the other hand, the defense felt that when the traffic cops were running after Alro or riding after Alro, they kept seeing this gun go back and forth and back and forth. And they felt that Alro was in a very hectic mental state that he didn't know whether he was going to take his own life or not. But when they did take him for psychiatric testing, they found that he had quite a low IQ compared to his peers of the same age. And he also had a very impulsive personality. So the psychologist felt that with being a teenager, being very dramatic in emotions and feeling things very incredibly, he felt that with teenagers' high emotional state as well as being very impulsive, this was quite a bad mix. And he also felt that Alro's decision-making capability was very lowered, but the judge and the prosecution didn't feel that this was enough of a psychiatric evaluation to make the sentencing any less because even though he had a compromised decision-making capabilities, Alro knew right from wrong. So he knew, if I shoot my parents, that is going to be wrong. Just because you have trouble making decisions doesn't mean that you don't know right or wrong in this case with Alro. But after looking at all the factors and thinking about the mitigating factors as well, the judge thought about it for a couple of days before he then handed down the sentence of 20 years for each murder and 28 months for using the firearm illegally. But because Alro was a minor when he was arrested and murdered his family, he was not technically handed a life sentence. Remember, life sentences in South Africa are 25 years. So he was given to the state for a maximum of 20 years. And since then, Alro has now been released from prison and is a free man. But let me know what you think about this case. When I first read about it and I read about his sentencing, I actually felt a little bit conflicted because I felt so guilty or bad that this young boy was going to jail for 20 years for each family that he murdered, that he was going to jail for such a long time. But then you have to remember that he in cold blood sat there and loaded the pistol. He did that. He put each bullet inside the gun and he went down the passage and looked at his father and mother and brother and shot them all point blank between the eyes. And not only that, but also what he did in the 2 days after. He didn't go to police straight after and confess what he had done. He went to a party, he went drinking, he went on some binger or rager or whatever they call it. But he didn't go straight to the police. He tried to run. And yes, you could say he was a child, he was scared. Yes, he is a child and he was scared, but he still did some heinous crimes. However, within the book, there was a psychologist and she said something quite interesting, which I thought also puts another spin and kind of a mitigating factor on this whole case, which I'm sure the judge thought about, but it is quite interesting. That even though there may be multiple siblings from the same parent within the same household, you will never have or live the same experience as your siblings. So you might have 2 brothers or 2 sisters, and yes, you have the same parents, but each person goes out every day by themselves. They have different friends or different type of experience in the big wide world, which alter their actual personality. So Alro and his siblings might have had the same parents and same type of environment. However, he went to boarding school. His brothers didn't go to boarding school. He was quite a different age gap to his brothers. So he lived a very different story to his brothers. So his brothers might have said that they lived a quite normal childhood, but that might not have been the case for Alro's mentality or his mental state at the time. But just a little tidbit to think about, which I thought is quite interesting. I have a younger brother and we brought up in the same household, same parents, but we are quite a few years apart, and even though we grew up in the same household, we are completely different people. But anyway, let me know if this is your case as well with your siblings, if you feel that you have a completely different life to your siblings, but also what you think about this case. I hope you all have a fantastic day further. Please stay safe out there and I'll see you again next week. Bye.